conversation on important lessons from the life of St. Ignatius of Loyola. So the topic is important lessons from the life of St. Ignatius. So before we get to the lessons, let's talk briefly about the life of St. Ignatius. And as I go on with this, we can already begin to see some lessons. But at the end, the second part of my talk, I will come down to 5 important lessons we can learn from the life of St. Ignatius. 5. There are more, as you will see, but I want us to stop at this 5, and I will explain why later on. So when we talk about St. Ignatius of Loyola, when we hear the word Loyola, what comes to our mind? Which part of the world is that? Loyola. Does anyone know where Loyola is found in the world? Europe. Yes, it's in Europe. Which country today? Okay. So, Loyola is in today's Spain. So it's in Europe, Spain. So St. Ignatius was born in the year 1491. I don't think any of us here was born at that time. After you were born, Catholics. Okay. So he was born in the year 1491. And he was born into this family that was, you can say, well-to-do. And very quickly, Ignatius began to be a man who was very attracted to the things of the world, like material things. He had this strong desire to be someone who was well known, a strong desire to be a soldier, which he would become later on, but not just to be any other soldier, but to be one that was distinguished. So we begin to see first of all here that Ignatius was a man of great desire to do great things. Great things for the fame, for the honor that comes with that. And so in the year 1508, he becomes a page in the kingdom of Castile, and he will become a soldier. And in the year 1521, in a battle between Spain, as we said earlier on in Spanish, between Spain and France, Ignatius will get wounded in this battle. The battle was fought in Pamplona. So imagine a soldier who wanted to be a very distinguished soldier, fighting in battle, and gets injured. First of all, it's a sign that perhaps his hopes of becoming this distinguished soldier was going to fade away. We can see this injury as a setback to all his desires for honor, for fame, and all of that. So Ignatius is wounded in 1521 and is taken back home to recover. Now, those days they didn't have the kind of bullets we have nowadays. There was what is called the cannonball, which hit his leg. So now if he cannot move, it means he can no longer fight. He can no longer be a soldier. So now he goes back home to recover. And being a man who likes things of the world, he asks for books to read. So this is another thing we learn from Ignatius, the love for learning, which we'll come back to later on. So he asked for books to read, not just anyhow books, but books that talk about bravery, to give more courage, more encouragement, motivation as a soldier who is wounded. And they told him that we don't have books of this type here. We have books of the life of Christ, books about the lives of the saints. So imagine a soldier who wanted books about bravery, fighting, and is given a book of the life of Christ and the life of the saints. It can imagine at first to be boring to this kind of person. But Ignatius continued to read his books. And as he read them, something was happening within him. Another lesson we'll come back to. And he began to pay attention to what was going on within him. And what was this? He realized that speaking and writing about St. Dominic, St. Francis, and all the great things they have done, he himself wanted to do greater things like that. A man of desire. You can say competition. He would say, if St. Dominic can do this, I too can do it. If St. Francis can do this, I too can do it. So a man of desire, reading these books about the life of the saints, and he too wants to become like them. And he began to imagine himself on a sick bed, imagine himself doing these things. And he began to notice that when he thought about or imagined himself doing all the brave things to bring him honor and wealth, of course it made him happy. Again, when he thought about doing the kinds of things that St. Dominic and St. Francis did, he also found out that he was also happy interiorly doing that. But he began to notice a difference. That the happiness that he felt when he thought about doing the kinds of things that St. Dominic and St. Francis did was a different and superior kind of happiness, interior joy. And so that was the beginning of his conversion. So a man who wanted to fight, to become this great soldier, gets converted. And the beginning of this conversion is an injury. So a setback brought about his conversion. That's one thing we can learn from Ignatius. And so he begins to want to convert, and he goes on a pilgrimage. And part of that, he will surrender his sword that he was using for battle. Now, he's renouncing this desire to be a soldier, to be a different kind of soldier. If you want a soldier for Christ. And this will begin a long journey of conversion for St. Ignatius. A long journey that will involve taking note of what's going on within him. He will come to see his sins from his youth. He will have scruples about his sins. But all the while, he's progressing. And he will say that God was dealing with him personally, teaching him just as a teacher teaches his students. So he was learning from God. And then he will decide to be a priest. Now, to be a priest, you have to study. At this point, he didn't have the studies. So he decides to go back to school in the year 1524. Now, let's do a little mathematics here. He was born in 1491. How old will he be in 1524? What are those good maths?
In his 30s. In his 30s or 40s.
Huh? 22?
No, 30, in his 30s.
34 years.
He was born in 1491. Now he's going back to school in 1524. How old was he?
33.
33 years.
33 years.
Okay. Now imagine a man of 33 years old sitting with children in a classroom to learn Latin. How do you think that must have felt? So he went back to school to learn Latin grammar as part of what he needed to become a priest. So I talked about later on the love for learning. We'll come back to it later on. So Ignatius begins to learn. And then he will go on to the University of Paris in 1529, where he will encounter other students, fellow students like him. And in this, some were his roommates. And these fellow students, to today are also saints. One of them is St. Francis Xavier. Another of his fellow students is St. Peter Faber. Now, Ignatius, remember, he was just newly converted. Now, he will go on to start converting other people. But how did he do this? By conversations. That's another lesson we'll come back to. Spiritual conversations. Talking to them about his own experience of God, how God has been present to him in his life. And with that, he was able to help his schoolmates, his classmates, to also experience this in God. So we see St. Ignatius, who uses spiritual conversations to help his classmates to experience what he himself has experienced. And all this while, with his experience of conversion, he kept a notebook like this, where he was writing what was going on in his life, his spiritual experiences. Another lesson we'll come back to shortly. So he was writing these experiences, and he was beginning to use these experiences to help others, beginning with his friends. And so, with these friends of his, they will all be ordained priests. And with these friends, they will found what we have today as the Society of Jesus, Jesuits. So you see that the Jesuits, which began in the year 1540, began with an experience of St. Ignatius. A spiritual experience which he was able to share with his friends. An experience of God, an experience of conversion, and he was not ashamed or afraid to share this experience with his friends along the way. Taking notes of how God has been present in his life, he was able to use to share with his friends. And so in the year 1541, Ignatius will be made the first general superior of the Jesuits. And he occupied this position until he died in 1556. So he was born in 1491 and he died in 1556. How old was he when he died? 65 years. So Ignatius only lived for 65 years. But within this time, so he was superior general from 1541 to 1556. And he wrote 7,000 letters during this time. Communication, we'll come back to that. So he was superior of the Jesuits, the first superior general we had. And he died on July 31st, 1556. And that's why we celebrate the feast day of St. Ignatius when?
31st July.
July 31st. So in summary, this is the life of St. Ignatius of Loyola. We see a man who was born, who had great ambition, great desire to be someone who is reputable, someone of honor, of fame, of wealth. And this dream was going on smoothly until, you can say, an accident happens, an injury, a setback. This cannonball that hits his leg. This setback becomes a means, the beginnings of his conversion. And from there on, he becomes one who is a pilgrim, trying to dedicate his life, his entire life, to God. So from being a soldier of the world, from being a lover of the world of material things, St. Ignatius decides, after his conversion, to be a different kind of soldier now, one for Christ, to win souls, to help souls to grow in a relationship with God. So this is St. Ignatius. Now, what can we learn from the life of St. Ignatius? Like I mentioned earlier on, there are many things we can learn from his life. But I want us to focus on five. Five because it's easy to use our fingers to represent the five lessons. And these are five lessons that we'll be coming back to in one form or another during this month of July. So it's good to remember these five lessons so that as we move on during this month of July with our different sessions, you can ask yourself, today's session was on which of these lessons from the life of St. Ignatius? So lesson number one is what we can call awareness. Like I mentioned, when he was injured and recovering, he began to read. Not just reading, but he was aware of what was going on within him. Awareness of what was going on within him, how he was feeling, the desires, the emotions that were coming up within him. Awareness. And this awareness is an awareness of God's presence. Awareness of God's presence. And a practice of this awareness is what we did at the beginning of today's session, the exam. Awareness. Awareness of how God has been present to me from the beginning of the day up to this point. Awareness of how I have responded to God's presence in my life. So lesson number one, awareness. And throughout this month of July, in our different sessions, we'll be practicing this awareness through the exam, trying to inculcate this attitude, this habit of being aware of the presence of God in our lives, like St. Ignatius. So lesson number one is awareness. Lesson number two, from awareness is discernment. Now that I know what is going on within me, I ask myself, what does God want me to do? And for St. Ignatius, this is a very important question. Not what I want, but what is God's will for me? Discernment. And one way to do this is prayer. Prayer. Not just any kind of prayer, but praying with the scriptures, meditation as one form of prayer. And in this kind of prayer is what we do during a retreat. And during this month of July, we would also have a retreat, where we practice this kind of prayer, meditation on God's word. How does the word of God speak to me here and now, as a person, here and now? So, lesson number one was awareness. Number two, discernment. And Ignatius was really a man of discernment after his conversion. For him, it was all about doing God's will and searching for God's will each day. The examine is one way of searching for God's will for me. A retreat is another way of searching for God's will for me. Lesson number three that we can learn from the life of St. Ignatius is spiritual conversation. Like I mentioned, Ignatius did not convert his friends by shouting and preaching to them. He did that by conversations. I remember last year during this Ignatian month, Father Uja gave us a talk on spiritual conversations and how we can practice that in our families. So during this month of July, we will also be practicing and learning that. Spiritual conversations, faith sharing, sharing our faith. You know that sometimes we think that to convert another person, you have to preach and quote the Bible. That's one way. Another way that's very effective is also sharing your spiritual experiences. How have I experienced God today? I can share to another person, and that becomes a way of touching that person. And that person knows that yes, God is alive and active. So spiritual conversation, which we can do through faith sharing. And during this month of July, we'll also be learning about faith sharing. How to share our faith. Most times our conversations are about every other thing except about God. Sometimes our conversations with our families, as friends, are about everything except about our spiritual life. But not for Ignatius. Even with his friends, conversations can be spiritual conversations. Conversations about my experience of God, how has God been present to me. So that's lesson number 3. Lesson number 1, awareness. Number 2, discernment. Number 3, spiritual conversations. Lesson number 4 is devotion. Devotion. And here I will talk about devotion to Our Lady. After his conversion, St. Ignatius surrendered the sword to Our Lady of Montserrat. And throughout his life, St. Ignatius had a particular devotion to Our Lady of the Way. Now, Our Lady of the Way, imagine the way where you are walking. And for Ignatius, our Blessed Virgin Mary is one that accompanies us on our way. So devotion to Mary, Our Lady of the Way, accompanying us as pilgrims in our own pilgrimage, personal pilgrimages and our communal pilgrimages. Mary accompanies us on that way. So that's one lesson we can learn from St. Ignatius. Devotion. Devotion to Our Lady of the Way. The 5th important lesson that we can learn from the life of St. Ignatius is doing everything for the greater glory of God. Doing everything for the greater glory of God. Like we mentioned, St. Ignatius was a man of great ambition, desire. After his conversion, he used the same energy, the same desire, the same ambition, but now not for his own honor and glory, but for what? The greater glory of God. So all our projects, all our goals, all our plans can be geared towards the greater glory of God. So that's one thing we can pick up from the life of St. Ignatius. There are other things we can his love for learning. So some of us complain that Jesuits go to school too much. We got that from St. Ignatius. Learning. But I want us to say with these 5 important lessons. Awareness of God's presence, which you can practice every day, once a day, twice a day, through the exam, which we started practicing today, and which will continue throughout the month of July and beyond the month of July. Awareness of God's presence. Second is discernment, which you can practice through spiritual exercises. Like Ignatius says, if you are preparing to run, to go for a race, you do physical exercises. Those of us who want flat tummies, some of us will be willing to do exercises to get flat tummies. In the same way, in our spiritual life as well, there are spiritual exercises that we can do. And one of them is meditation, which we see in the life of St. Ignatius. And it's something we'll be practicing and learning more about in the course of this month. Lesson number 3, spiritual conversations, which you can practice through faith sharing. Number 4, devotion to Our Lady. And number 5, doing everything for the greater glory of God. So let's go over these 5 lessons again. Number 1 is what?
Awareness.
Number 2?
Silence.
Number 3?
Visual conversation.
Number 4? Number 5?
Do everything for the future glory of God.
Okay. Thank you very much.